I never thought I'd be standing on the sidewalk in front of my own home, the home where I raised my son, where I planted roses along the front walk, where I still kept a framed photo of his first birthday on the mantel, holding a single garbage bag of clothes while he stood in the doorway and told me my room had already been cleared out. "You can stay at a motel tonight, Mom," he said. "I'll Venmo you something." He didn't even look at me when he said it. That was 3 days after we buried my husband of 41 years. My name is not important. What matters is that for 4 decades, I was the kind of wife and mother who showed up. I cooked Sunday dinners every single week without missing one. I drove my son to baseball practice for 8 years straight, even the years when his team lost every game and he cried in the car on the way home. When my husband Gerald was diagnosed with a heart condition in his late 50s, I went to every cardiology appointment, took notes, learned the medication names, learned what foods to watch. I did not do these things for credit. I did them because I loved my family, and that is simply what love looks like when it is real. Gerald was a quiet man who built things slowly. He had started a small commercial real estate company in our mid-sized Ohio city back in the early 1990s. Nothing flashy, just steady work, buying undervalued industrial properties, leasing them to manufacturers and warehouses. Over 30 years, that company became worth something real. Not the kind of money that makes the news, but the kind that means your family never has to worry. Gerald never talked about it much. He came from Depression-era grandparents and believed that discussing money at the dinner table was bad manners. What I did not know, what I had no reason to know, because Gerald handled the business and I trusted him completely, was how he had structured everything in his will. He died on a Tuesday morning in October. Massive cardiac event. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time after they took him. I don't know how long. The light changed. The room got cold. At some point, my son, I'll call him my son because that is what he is and was, regardless of what came after, arrived, and I thought he was there for me. His name is Scott. He is 42 years old. He married a woman named Gwendolyn about 6 years ago, and I had tried, genuinely tried, to have a relationship with her. I brought food when they moved into their house. I remembered her birthday. I watched their dog when they traveled. I won't pretend we were close, but I thought we were respectful. Civil. Family. The reading of the will happened 4 days after Gerald was buried. I was still in the fog that comes with fresh grief, the kind where you go through motions and say thank you when people say they're sorry, and you eat food that neighbors drop off even though nothing has any taste. Scott came with me. Gwendolyn stayed home, which I thought was considerate at the time. The attorney was a man named Philip Decker, who had handled Gerald's business affairs for years. I had met him twice at company dinners. He had a calm, measured way of speaking that I had always found reassuring. He was not reassuring that morning. Gerald had left the business, the entire company, the properties, the operating accounts, everything, to Scott, not to both of us jointly, not to me with the provision for Scott later, to Scott, outright, effective immediately upon Gerald's death. I received the house, and a bank account with enough money in it to live modestly for perhaps 3 or 4 years if I was careful. I sat there and tried to understand what I was hearing. 41 years. I had been his partner for 41 years and he had left me the house and what amounted to a severance package. Philip looked at me with something careful in his expression. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "your husband updated this will 14 months ago. I want you to know that I encouraged him to reconsider the structure, and he told me it had been discussed with family." "It was not discussed with me," I said. Philip said nothing. He looked at his papers. Scott drove me home. He was quiet the whole way, which I told myself was grief, because I was not ready yet to think anything else. When we got to the house, he came inside and I made coffee. Because that is what I do. I make coffee, and I sit with people. And we talked, or I talked, about Neveries, about being lost, and he listened and seemed present. I thought we were grieving together. He came back the next morning with Gwendolyn. I was still in my robe, I hadn't slept. I had sat in Gerald's armchair for most of the night just to be near something of his. She walked through the front door with a tablet in her hand and started talking about renovation timelines. I did not immediately understand what was happening. I asked her to repeat herself. She explained in a tone that was patient in the way that customer service representatives are patient, that Scott had decided to sell the house. It was, after all, an asset of the estate, and they were hoping to list it within 60 days, which meant they would need me to begin packing relatively soon. "This is my home," I said. "Mom." That was Scott. He was looking out the kitchen window. "You got the house in the will, yeah? But the house is part of the larger estate assets, and it makes more sense to liquidate." "I got the house," I said. "Gerald left me the house." "It's complicated," Gwendolyn said. I looked at my son. He still would not look at me. I argued. I want to say I stood up right then and drew a line. But the truth is, I was 63 years old and 4 days out from burying my husband, and I didn't have the strength. When Scott said I should maybe stay with my sister in Columbus while they sorted things out, I packed a bag, one garbage bag of clothes. I stood on my own front walk, and I looked at the roses I had planted in 2011, and I got in my car and I drove away. I cried for approximately the first hour and 40 minutes of that drive. Then I went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when something in you simply stops, like a circuit breaker tripping. My sister Roberta met me at the door. She took one look at my face and pulled me inside and made me tea and didn't ask a single question for 2 full days. I have been grateful for that every day since. On the 3rd day, she sat down across from me at her kitchen table and she said, "Have you talked to anyone yet about the will?" I told her what Philip had said, about the update 14 months ago, about the structure. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Barb, I think you need to talk to another lawyer." I told her I didn't have money for lawyers. "You have a house," she said. "Until someone proves otherwise, you have a house." Her friend from church had a nephew who was an estate attorney. His name was Warren. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, maybe, and he had the manner of someone who had heard a great many sad stories and had learned how to sit inside them without flinching. He met me at his office on a Thursday afternoon, and he listened for nearly an hour without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me one question. "Do you know what your husband's company was worth at the time the will was updated?" I told him I didn't know exactly. He asked if Gerald had ever discussed making any changes to how the company was structured, any new advisors, any conversations about trusts or estate planning that involved Scott specifically. I thought about it, and then I remembered something, a conversation at dinner, maybe 2 years ago, that I had not thought about since. Scott had brought up something about tax strategies. Gerald had seemed interested. Gwendolyn had been there. I had excused myself to get more bread, and when I came back they were talking about something else. Warren wrote something down. He asked if he could request the full will filing, the amendment history, and any correspondence attached to the estate account. He explained this in plain language, and I want to do the same here, because I think this is the part of the story people don't tell, and they should. When a spouse dies and leaves assets directly to an adult child rather than the surviving spouse, and when that will was updated recently, and when the surviving spouse had no awareness of the update, that can raise legal questions. Not always, not automatically, but sometimes it raises questions about undue influence, about whether someone close to the deceased was present during the estate planning process in ways they shouldn't have been. Warren said he wasn't promising anything. He told me these cases were slow and uncertain, but he said the timing and the structure were unusual enough that he wanted to look more closely. I went back to Robert's house and I sat in her guest room and I thought about my son. My boy who I had watched come into the world, who I had held every night through ear infections and nightmares, who had called me from college when he was lonely, who had slow danced with me at his wedding 2 years after we had never been close enough with Gwendolyn to. I couldn't finish the thought. I didn't sleep much that week either. 3 weeks later, Warren called me and asked me to come back to his office. He had the documents spread across the conference table. He walked me through them slowly, and I would try to explain what he found in the same plain way he explained it to me. The will had been updated 14 months before Gerald's death. The appointment for the update had been scheduled by Scott's office, not by Gerald directly, by Scott's assistant, using an email account that was connected to the company. Philip had assumed Gerald had delegated the scheduling. That is not uncommon. But the correspondence attached to the estate file included several emails between Scott and Philip. In some of them, Scott had provided specific language for how assets should be categorized. Philip had pushed back at least once, suggesting the structure seemed to disadvantage the surviving spouse, and Scott had responded with a note saying that his father had fully reviewed and approved all terms. Gerald's own emails from that period showed no such review. What they showed was a man who was tired and trusting his son to handle the details. "Is this fraud?" I asked. Warren chose his words carefully. "It raises serious questions about whether the will reflects your husband's actual informed wishes or whether it reflects language that was introduced by a third party with an interest in the outcome." I thought about Gerald at dinner 2 years ago, his face when Scott talked about tax strategies. He had trusted his son. He had been proud of the fact that Scott was interested in the business. He had probably believed he was being efficient by letting Scott coordinate with the attorney. I cried in Warren's conference room, not from relief, not yet, just from the weight of understanding what had happened. My husband had not chosen this. My husband had been maneuvered. The legal process that followed is not something I'll detail fully here because it took months and was deeply exhausting. What I will tell you is this. Warren filed a formal challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence. The estate was flagged. The company accounts were frozen pending the challenge, which meant Scott could not access or liquidate the major assets, including the house. When Scott found out about the freeze, he called. I did not answer. He called Roberta. She told him I was unavailable. He called Warren directly, and Warren told him professionally and briefly that the matter was now in the hands of the court and that further communications should go through counsel. 2 weeks after that, I got a different kind of call, not from Scott, from Gwendolyn. She called on a Sunday evening, and when I picked up, she was crying, which was something I had genuinely never heard from her before. She said they hadn't understood how serious it was. She said Scott was devastated. She said he had never meant for things to go this far. I held the phone and I listened. I did not say much. Then she said something I will not forget. She said, "He thought he was protecting the business. He thought you'd be okay with just the house. He didn't think you'd fight." I let that sit for a moment. "He thought I wouldn't fight," I said. "He's your son," she said, and her voice cracked. "He loves you." I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment. It was not simple. There was grief in it. Grief for the family I thought I had. Grief for the version of my son I had believed in. There was anger that had been sitting so quietly underneath everything that I had almost mistaken it for sadness. And there was something else. Something that felt like the circuit breaker clicking back on. "Tell Scott," I said slowly, "that if he wants to talk to me, he can talk to me. Not through you, not through a lawyer. He can come to Roberta's house, sit at her kitchen table, and talk to his mother." She said she would tell him. He came on a Wednesday, alone. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping, which I noticed and then caught myself noticing. He sat down at Roberta's table, and Roberta made herself scarce with the kind of grace she has always had. And Scott and I sat across from each other, and he cried. He really cried, which is something I had not seen from him since he was a teenager. I did not reach across the table to comfort him. I let him cry. When he stopped, I said, "Tell me what happened. All of it, from the beginning. And he did. He told me that Gwendolyn had initially brought up the estate planning, that she had contacts in financial management who had talked about asset protection strategies, and that it had all seemed legitimate and sensible, the way things can seem sensible when you want them to be. He told me he had told himself that Gerald knew what he was doing, that if Dad had any objections, he would have said something. He told me he had not fully let himself understand that Gerald was a man who trusted his son and would not have questioned documents his son handed him to sign. He told me he was sorry. I looked at my son for a long time, at his father's forehead and his father's hands. Sorry doesn't give me back the last 3 months, I said. And it doesn't give me back your father, who spent his whole life building something and deserved to have his real wishes honored. I know, he said. I don't know yet what I'm willing to do here, I told him. I need time. But I need you to understand something. I leaned forward. I am not a woman who can be moved out of her own life because it's convenient. I never was. I don't know why you thought I was. He didn't have an answer for that. The legal process ended in mediation. Gwendolyn's involvement in the estate planning process and Scott's coordination with Philip gave my attorney enough leverage that Scott agreed to a revised distribution. I received a proper share of the estate's value, not everything, but a fair and substantial portion, enough to live without fear, enough to stay in the house. I did stay in the house. I walked back through my own front door in February, which in Ohio means grey skies and bare branches and the kind of cold that gets into your bones. But there were my roses, still there, pruned down for winter, waiting. Philip retired shortly after. I've never asked Scott exactly what conversations were had between them. Gwendolyn, I still find difficult. That is honest. We are polite. We are careful. I do not think we will ever be close. But Scott and I have been rebuilding something, slowly the way you rebuild after a flood, checking each board before you put your weight on it. He called me on my birthday in March. He did not just text. He called, and we talked for almost an hour about his father and about when he was small and about nothing in particular, the way people who love each other talk when they are trying to remember how. I do not know if I have forgiven him fully. Forgiveness, I have come to think, is not a door you walk through once. It is more like a garden, something you tend, something that requires returning to, something that is never quite finished. What I know is this. I was a woman who planted roses and cooked Sunday dinners and showed up for 41 years. I was not a woman who could simply be handed a garbage bag and told to go. My husband knew that once. I think in the end his real wishes were on my side all along. I keep coming back to that moment on my own front walk. The roses I planted in 2011, the garbage bag in my hand, my son standing in the doorway not quite meeting my eyes. For a long time I turned that image over, looking for the exact place where things went wrong. Was it that dinner 2 years before Gerald died, when I got up to get the bread and came back to find the conversation had shifted? Was it the moment I handed Gerald my complete trust and never once asked to read a document? I don't think there's a single crack to point to. I think it happened the way most quiet disasters happen, gradually in small steps that each seemed reasonable until you looked at where you'd ended up. What Gerald had was decency, 41 years of it. He built something real because he showed up honestly every single day, and he trusted his son with the work because he believed that decency was something you passed down just by living it in front of people. He was not wrong about that being how it works. He was just wrong about whether it had taken. What Scott had, and I say this as his mother, which means I say it with grief as much as judgment, was intelligence without the conscience to guide it. He is a smart man. He always was. He could see the shape of a situation, identify the leverage points, move the pieces. What he could not seem to do or would not do was ask himself whether he should. Gwendolyn handed him a strategy and he found reasons to believe it was acceptable. That is not a failure of brains, that is a failure of character, and those are not the same thing. What I had when it came down to it was stubbornness. I don't mean that as a compliment exactly. It's just the honest word. I was 63 years old, and I had just lost my husband, and I was standing on the sidewalk with one bag of clothes, and something in me that had been quiet my whole life simply refused to accept that this was the ending. I did not feel strong. I felt hollowed out. But I made the drive to Roberta's. I sat at her kitchen table. I let Warren pull the documents and ask the questions I didn't know to ask. I kept going back, kept getting up, kept not letting it be finished. That is all resilience really is, I think. Not some grand inner fire, just the refusal to stop moving when stopping would be easier. What Warren found in those files mattered because truth, when it's documented, has a kind of patience to it. It just waits. Scott had moved fast and assumed I wouldn't understand or wouldn't fight, and neither of those assumptions held. The records showed what they showed. The timeline said what it said. You cannot spend 40 years building something honest and then have a year of manipulation erase it. Not entirely, not if someone is paying attention. Scott and I are not what we were. I don't know if we ever will be. But he called on my birthday and we talked for an hour. And at one point he laughed at something I said. A real laugh. The one I remember from when he was young. And I thought, there he is. There is the person Gerald and I raised. Is still in there somewhere, and so is the possibility that he finds his way back to himself. I don't know that I've fully forgiven him, but I know what it cost him to sit at that table and tell me the truth, and I know what it cost me to stay in the room and listen. Some things you do not forgive all at once. You just decide slowly to keep showing up anyway. That is what 41 years of marriage taught me, and it turns out it applies to more than just marriage.